Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the New York Society Library. I'm Carolyn Waters, the director and head librarian. We're thrilled to have you here, and those of you on the live stream as well. As we begin, we acknowledge that the library stands on the traditional land of the Lenape people, to whom we pay respect. We're really pleased to be able to offer such a vibrant season of events and authors like tonight's. Most of our events are open to the public, so please take a look at our website or speak to a staff member to find out more about what's coming up. We have a whole great season of really fun and exciting events. And tonight, we're honored to have with us Ava Chin. She is also the author of the award-winning Eating Wildly and the former urban forager columnist for the New York Times. She edited Split, Stories from a Generation Raised on Divorce, and she has also written for the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Saveur, Marie Claire, The Village Voice, Spin, and Vibe, among others. She has held fellowships at the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the U.S. Fulbright Scholars Program, and the Asian American Writers Workshop. She is a professor of creative nonfiction and journalism at the CUNY Graduate Center and the College of Staten Island. She is also a longtime member of the New York Society Library, who I've been fortunate to get to know over the years. So we're thrilled to have her here in this room. Ava's latest book, Mott Street, A Chinese-American Family Story of Exclusion and Homecoming, has been called stunning by Publishers Weekly and has earned rave reviews from the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Kirkus, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among others. The New York Times described it as sensitive, ambitious, well-reported, while Gavin Newsham in the New York Post called it a remarkable story. Mott Street is the focal point of an extraordinary tale of an extended family that throws itself into making life in America work. We do have copies of Mott Street for sale by Sasha from the corner bookstore right out here. And for those of you who are on the live stream, the link to purchase your copy online is in the chat. Please join me in welcoming Ava Chin.
Aw, thank you for that lovely introduction. It is so nice to be here with you. For many years, the Society Library has been a home. I finished not Mott Street, but the book before, Eating Wildly, upstairs. I remember I was in the larger writer's room. It was very quiet. I wanted to go, yes! But I refrained. But it was a really lovely moment. Most of the book, this book, Mott Street, was actually written downtown in Chinatown, on that very street. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. As Carolyn mentioned, I am a professor at CUNY. I'm also a journalist and the author of Mott Street. Mott Street is a nonfiction narrative about the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act laws on 4 generations of my family in New York's Chinatown as they attempted to lay down roots in America. The book revolves around a singular building at the intersection of Mott and Pell in the very heart of Chinatown, where so many generations of my family lived and worked, including my great-grandparents, my grandparents, my father and his siblings, and finally, my generation. I'm going to be talking to you tonight about the challenges of writing a giant family biography with multiple generations and a very large, wide scope, and where decades of research had to be threaded together into a single unifying narrative, where there was both a plethora of materials from a certain perspective on one hand, but scant archives on the other, especially regarding the lives of the women, and where sometimes the archives themselves were so prickly and contained such vitriol against people who looked like me and my family members that some days it felt like I had entered a landmine. So to explain the genesis of how this book came about, you need to know a little bit about me. I am a 5th-generation Chinese-American New Yorker. I'm also raised by a single mother in Flushing, Queens, and I'm the proud descendant of a Chinese railroad worker. And growing up, there were so many secrets in my family, and I had so many questions. The first was, who was my elusive father? And who was this family that I was estranged from? Why did the people who raised me only ever speak about them in whispers? And why were there so many family secrets? And were they really bigwigs in Chinatown? The second was, what actually happened to our ancestor who worked on the nation's first transcontinental railroad, and why was he eventually pushed out of his home in Boise, Idaho, decades after the transcontinental was completed, when the work that he did was the greatest engineering marvel of the 19th century? It unified the country physically after the Civil War. And then thirdly, how come, as a fifth-generation Chinese-American New Yorker, I was such an anomaly here on the East Coast? Why did I almost never meet another Asian American like myself with such deep roots in this country? And on the rare occasion when I did, why did we invariably discover that we were in fact related, like someone's idea of a big fat joke? All roads led me to two major points of interest. The first was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the country's first restrictive federal immigration act. It effectively halted our legal immigration into this country, and it blocked a pathway towards our citizenship for over 60 years. It also set the tone for future immigration restrictions going forward, so that by 1917 and 1924, all Asians were banned from coming over into this country, with the exception of the Philippines, because the Philippines was occupied by the US at the time. And there were restrictions against Southern and Eastern Europeans as well. The second point of interest is a single tenement apartment building on Mott Street, in the heart of New York's Chinatown, where both sides of my family became friends, rivals, neighbors, and rather upstairs, downstairs neighbors from each other. And eventually, decades later, generations later, through my own birth, family, kin. We have lived continuously in this building for over 100 years, and it is where I wrote the majority of Mott Street. Mott Street is a family biography / memoir, weaving together the lives of so many generations of my family in New York, but it's told from my point of view. I trace their origins from the southern part of China to the backbreaking labor of the Transcontinental Railroad and the brutalities of frontier town racism, to where they finally landed in New York, where they became merchants, civic leaders, and heads of the Chinese Tong. Throughout the course of the narrative, I reunited with my father for the first time in 27 years. But I soon discovered that exclusion is not just a political condition, but can be deeply personal as well, and even felt within one's own family. So if I was doing a slideshow, this would be the moment where I would show you this big slide that indicates all of the different years that Chinese exclusion was on the books and its different iterations. But I'm not going to bore you with that slide. You need to know, in terms of Chinese exclusion, it was generally on the books from 1882 to 1943. But the run-up and the continuation of Chinese exclusion really culminated in almost 100 years of exclusion. And the roots of this story go back earlier in the 19th century to a period in time in which our young country was asking itself, who is an American and who is not? Who is one of us and who is not? And some of the central question the book addresses is, what happens when, during the era of Reconstruction, when the country was attempting to build itself anew, what happens when electives on the West Coast, who were decidedly anti-Chinese, work with entrenched Southern politicians who were intent upon maintaining supremacy, strike deals with one another to close the national borders for the very first time in order to keep out people who look like my family, and from my family's country of origin, people who looked like me, and then later, not just a single country, but an entire continent. What happens when they create, in the 19th century, the longest running and most restrictive immigration laws? What happens when they enact immigration laws against other nationalities outside of Asia to Southern and Eastern European as well? And what does it mean for us as a nation today? And what does it say about us going forward? How does it make us vulnerable as a population to politicians stoking fires against the other for their own personal gain? Largely, this happens during election cycles. And how does it make us vulnerable to divisions that are stoked among us and blind to the contributions of a significant part of the population? Now, one of the most daunting challenges that I faced when working on this book was actually internal. The book was daunting. Who was I to think that I could write this book? This was a book that was going to take years of my life, that was going to need time and resources that I didn't think I had, language and literacy skills that I certainly lacked. And so this book, I pushed it back to the back burner over and over again until one day, something shifted. A series of events unfolded as if the universe was sending me signs. So the first thing was a reporter from the Forward newspaper reached out with the information that a family member, my great-great-uncle Deck, took part in New York City fundraisers for Kishinev pogrom victims in 1903. Chinese helping Jews in that period, I was under the impression that Chinese in that period of time at the turn of the century could barely support themselves, much less come to the aid of others. Another thing that happened, a colleague at NYU made an introduction that unlocked my grandfather's oral history, the grandfather from the side of the family I was estranged from, an oral history that I had been chasing for 20 years. And then third, I attended an exhibit at the New York Historical Society on the Chinese Exclusion Act laws that had images of work that my family did fighting exclusion in the courts in 1892, the places where other family members were detained, and thirdly, even my great-grandfather's ID papers were hanging on the walls. All of those things cumulated together, and then everything changed for me, and a frame became visible, a frame that could encompass all of those family stories I'd been collecting since childhood, that answered so many of the questions that had been dogging me since I was little. And with that frame, I could finally see it and make that commitment. I took my family across the globe as a Fulbright Fellow to do the research for this book. It took all of my creative focus and energy for the past 7 years. It's kind of a secret. I chose only to have one child. But ultimately, deep down inside, I knew making that commitment was completely worth it. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the research. All right. When the writer from the Forward newspaper told me that there were files on my family members at the National Archives offices, it was the first time I realized that such records existed. Under the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese were the only ones required to carry ID papers with them at all times, and there were files kept on all Chinese living here tracing their comings and goings in and out of the country. But the silver lining for historians and writers like myself are that these files offered a wealth of information that were updated whenever someone left the country, because in order to get back in, they had to update the file. So when they left the country to go back home to visit their families, when they left the country to travel for business. My great-grandfather went to Cuba and to Canada because there were Chinese people living in Cuba and Canada in the early part of the 20th century. Whenever they attempted to bring their wives or children into the country, they had to update the files too. These files track the whereabouts of all Chinese in this country until the repeal of exclusion, which occurred during World War II, when our country needed an ally in China against Japan. Many of my family members died before this happened. I've even seen files on family members that were born here and by rights citizens of the United States. And these files were held in National Archives offices across the country, in Lower Manhattan, out in San Francisco, in the San Bruno area, and also in Seattle and in Boston. So one thing I should address is the larger question of what prompted Chinese exclusion to happen in the first place in 1882. So after the gold rush and the completion of the railroad, there was a great economic depression that rolled across the country. At the time, they called it the Great Depression until our Great Depression of the 20th century. So then they had to call it like the Long Depression or the Long Economic Recession, right? And after that happened, it ushered in a tsunami of hatred that resulted in over 200 towns in California pushing out their Chinese residents. It wasn't an isolated California movement, but also occurred in Washington State, Colorado, Wyoming, and Idaho, where upwards of 30% of the state population was Chinese. Different iterations of these expulsions occurred in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and many of my family members who were here at the time were forced to make a decision: stay and face an angry mob or flee. And one of my uncles, Uncle Dak Foon, fled Northern California, where he operated a laundry, and landed in New York City, where he befriended other Christian Chinese progressives who were ministers and merchants in the community. Now, Uncle Dick was a widower, and it was at church where he met his second wife, Elva Lisk, a white woman born in Pennsylvania and the daughter of a Civil War veteran. She had also been married once before. Aunt Elva was harboring a secret that was kept hidden until I was able to trace down her brother's descendants. And the secret finally reached my ears, but you'll have to read the book in order to discover what that is. When Uncle Dak and Aunt Elva got married, it was the same year that Chinese exclusion was made permanent. Under Chinese exclusion, no Chinese was allowed to naturalize. And 5 years later, an act was passed called the Expatriation Act. This was a law that stated that American women who married foreigners took on the citizenship of their husbands. Politicians at the time were intent upon preventing dual citizenship, and this was the era of what we call coverture, right? That meant that women and their property were bound to their husbands, right? So, and such women who married foreigners, who married non-Americans, were often viewed as traitors. And even wealthy heiresses who married lords were suspect for spreading their resources outside of the country. So unfortunately for Aunt Elva, who got married before the act, the law was retroactive, so it included her too. And so it was in 1907, in the eyes of our government, Aunt Elva, born in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a Civil War veteran, became Chinese. She even has a Chinese Exclusion Act file that I uncovered in Boston. Even after the law was altered in the 1920s, Elva still wouldn't have been able to easily naturalize until the repeal of Chinese exclusion some 35 years after losing her citizenship. This was particularly terrible for Aunt Elva because Aunt Elva was a bit of a firecracker and would have loved to have the opportunity to vote. And like a lot of American women, they did not realize that they had lost their citizenship until they filed to vote, right, when women finally gained suffrage. Okay, let's talk about a pivotal moment in the Chinese Exclusion Act history. Chinese exclusion was so restrictive that most folks, as I mentioned, could not get through into the country legally. But something happened in the early part of the 20th century. So I'm going to ask you, you're like my class. So what natural disaster happened in April of 1906? The Great San Francisco earthquake. Very good. You all get a gold star. The worst natural disaster in California history. It was felt all the way up from Oregon down to Los Angeles. The quake caused fires and even set the City Hall of Records building on fire, after which it later burned to the ground. And this single act created a giant fissure in the wall of Chinese exclusion, allowing Chinese to finally be able to enter by way of false aliases. So, in other words, somebody could say, actually, I was a citizen, I was born here in San Francisco, but my papers were in the City Hall records, right? Or my father was a citizen, so I'm a son of a citizen, right? And so this was one way that Chinese people were able to poke holes into this very restrictive immigration law. Let me tell you a little story, a little bit about my grandfather, Jean. My grandfather, Jean, was the person who raised me like a daughter. My grandpa, Jean, fled China in 1938 when Japan was invading during World War II, and he landed straight into the detention center in Seattle, Washington. Like many Chinese during the exclusion period, Grandpa Jean entered through this paper network. He was what we call a paper son. So his papers indicated that someone else was his father. It took me a really long time to figure out who that man in the papers were. I had to go back to our villages in China and talk to villagers, and this farmer finally said, oh yeah, that man, that's actually his uncle that is claiming to be his father, right? And so this was very common. You had a sponsor who claimed to be your father, or you claimed to be his son, and usually it was somebody either within your family or at least somebody from your village, so that you could answer the immigration officials' questions correctly. In the case of my grandfather, who didn't study very well, it's still a little bit of a mystery how he got in. I sometimes wonder if some of the paper that he pushed was monetary. Let's see. So there was this elaborate scheme involving white and Chinese smugglers, both in the United States as well as in Canada. It included lawyers, interpreters, men and women who claimed, again, that person's my son when they weren't. Christians who knew that the laws were wrong and who helped connect new arrivals to lawyers and contacts who could help people get through. I noticed that the Chinese Exclusion Act files, the interrogations were growing longer and more complex with every passing decade. So by the time that Grandpa Jean, who emigrated during the last years of China's exclusion, comes into the country in Seattle, he's got this file that's like an inch thick, and it is a complete and utter fiction. Now, these Chinese exclusion files were scattered all around the country. They were not easy to find because they're not in one central repository, with the exception of files that are at USCIS. They could be in any of the cities where family members or Chinese people lived. Once you do find them, it is possible to have them scanned, but I like looking at the paper and looking at the watermark and looking at the creases and feeling it in my hands. So I had to go and visit them all. And it was only after collecting the Chinese Exclusion Act files on each of my many family members, collecting them in Boston, San Francisco, Seattle, and New York, that I realized that Chinese exclusion turns all of the golden rules of research on its head. It is a commonly agreed upon general rule of thumb among us that it is the written record that is the gold standard, and the family stories that are suspect, dependent on faulty memory or research agenda, and long on embellishment and tall tales. But when you're Chinese in America with roots that stretch back all the way to the Exclusion era, it is the historical record by way of the government document that's a great fabrication. And the oral histories passed down from generation to generation that ultimately hold the keys to the truth. This realization for me opened up so many more possibilities to write the story. It gave me license to use the family stories, the stories that I collected from our villages, the oral histories in combination with archival research, newspaper articles both in English and Chinese Exclusion Act and the Exclusion Act documents to build a story from. So let's see, how are we doing on time? Okay, good. All right. So to get the fuller, wait, let me back up. So here's another question that I had to ask myself. How do you write a story about a marginalized community whose archives weren't deemed worthy of saving? In tenement apartment buildings in New York City, the deceased possessions are often tossed out as soon as they pass on. There are no trunks of archives in the attics here, right? So in order to get the fuller picture, I had to incorporate all of these various stories and give them license to be heard and provide my own discerning point of view. Most of the newspaper accounts in English of Chinese residents, including around the expulsions, were incredibly biased in places like California, Washington State, and Oregon because the editors were extremely sympathetic to the attackers. And consulting such archives was an exercise in reading against the grain. It was impossible for me not to take it personally because my family was living in these areas and directly impacted at the time. I found numerous articles advocating for boycotts or expulsions against Chinese people, reports of nameless Chinese being attacked. It was relentless, but very few articles about the victims themselves, very few in the English language articles from that period. For that, I had to read court testimonies. I learned many lessons in reading against the grain in 1880s and 1890s newspapers, flagging what seemed right, flagging what also seemed wrong, seeking out other points of views to counter it in Chinese newspapers, more balanced newspaper coverage from other parts of the country. I looked for interviews of folks on the ground. I paid attention to what Chinese folks said and the rare opportunity in the English language press when they were quoted. In my writing, I did not write this like a straight up history. I'm not a historian, right? This is really a blend of family memoir as well as general history. But in my writing, I was really honest about how I felt. I didn't try to pretend that I was a non-objective narrator. But by far the hardest thing to do with this book was to uncover the stories of the women, including my two great-grandmothers who were both wives of merchants who emigrated, one legally and one illegally across the Canadian border, both within 5 years of one another. One was a trained midwife from Hong Kong. The other was a fishmonger's daughter who married into the head of the On Long Tong, which was the business association. Later on, the New York English language press would talk about the Tongs as the Chinese mafia. And these two great-grandmothers lived directly upstairs and downstairs from each other. These women saw everything. In Hong Kong, they survived the plague. In New York City, they lived through the flu of 1918, the diphtheria epidemic, the loss of children, the Tong Wars, which saw shootings in the streets and hits on their husbands' heads and their brother-in-laws, police and government raids in Chinatown and on the building that housed us all. I drew great comfort in the first year of the pandemic, our pandemic, knowing that my family had weathered earlier epidemics, and perhaps I thought we could ride this one out as well. I was lucky because family members who were close to my great-grandmothers wrote about them and told me their stories. writing the story of my great-grandmothers, their struggles and their friendships in our building was probably one of the greatest joys that I had when working on this book. Mott Street is the culmination of decades of research where I zigzagged my way across the globe, interviewing family and friends and former residents of our building, gathering oral histories and documents and comparing it against the official record. But make no mistake, the Chinese Exclusion Act had very real consequences. When we look at the census for the first 4 decades of Chinese exclusion, from 1880 to 1920, those 4 decades, the records show that the Chinese population in this country fell by 25%, whereas the overall US population more than doubled. So I will repeat that. The total Chinese population here fell by 1/4, whereas the overall US population more than doubled. And that tells you, I think, everything you need to know about what the intent of Chinese exclusion was, and how important it was. When the pandemic hit, I was working on Mott Street in our apartment in the building that was a refuge for my entire family. And I watched as Chinatown was devastated by closures and loss of businesses because people were just too afraid to go down there. Then came the attacks and the anti-Asian scapegoating. And as the political climate grew worse and worse, I knew that this book was becoming more and more relevant. Since the start of the pandemic, there have been thousands of instances of anti-Asian hate in our country. And this terrifying rise in violence is actually a resurgence from our collective past and makes this work of understanding and inclusion all the more vital. Telling the fuller story of Chinese in America, our triumphs and our disappointments, through the intimate lens of my family on Mott Street has been a massive undertaking and an eye-opening privilege. Now, when I was growing up, I was taught never to air the dirty laundry, right? But it was only after doing all this research that I realized that this story was much larger than my father or myself. That I had uncovered a legacy of immigrant resilience in the face of discriminatory legislation, and the larger, untold stories of our contributions to this country, and ultimately, what it means to be Chinese in America. And I am thrilled to take you on this journey that is Mott Street. Thank you for listening. Yes.
I'm just curious to know, before you went back to southern China to interview your contacts, relatives, and friends for researching the book, did you already know what you were looking for, or was it more as much of an exploration as a sort of direct approach to find specific pieces of information? And also, I'm curious to know how they responded to you, that a daughter of China has come back from the United States to do this, carry out this massive undertaking that's so important. Were they excited to participate in this, or were they just giving you information?
So, So I'll try to answer them in order. I was open to both. I was looking for certain things. I was looking for documents, genealogy documents that may have survived the Cultural Revolution, right? You know how the genealogy, the biggest repository of genealogy documents in the United States, right, is connected to the Church of Latter-day Saints, right? But they have, that's who owns Ancestry, right? It has to do with going back and conversion, and that kind of thing. But I bring them up to say that in terms of genealogy and records, they don't have anything on Chinese people, because Chinese people collect the genealogies of their family members going back, generations. So I was able to find the genealogy documents on 3 sides of my family. And that was fantastic because it was just interesting to have these stories, right? One of them went back to the Yuan dynasty, which was the last Mongol dynasty in China. So that was very exciting. So I was able to find those. But then I had questions, right? And most of the time, the villagers were really happy to answer questions. Unless people were still in the village or still alive and it made them look bad. So, in which case they weren't so interested in talking. There was a generation in my Chin side of my family where the brothers turned against each other, and to the point where somebody was murdered, right? Someone was poisoned. So I asked them questions about this, and they were really happy to answer until I said, "Well, who actually did it?" And they were like, "Oh, I don't know." And then, what was the second part of your question?
Well, the response to what you were doing, that were they excited to participate in this project?
Oh, okay.
That would it seem important to them as well, or did they feel that way, or they were just helping you out in a sort of?
What I was really surprised about was that I was asking questions about my great grandfathers, right, who hadn't been back since, I don't know, before the 1920s. People would remember them. You know, one of them was like, I had heard from one villager that one great grandfather who lived in the building, who was married to the midwife, great grandmother, during World War II, Chinatown was raising money to send back for the war effort, right? And they said, I heard that my great grandfather, Dosham, had donated a plane for the cause. And then I talked to another villager, and he said, a plane. Dosham, donated 7 planes, right? So I couldn't believe that they still. I mean, this was back in 2017. I couldn't believe that they remembered that, right? I mean, these are people just walking by, like carrying sugar cane, and like they're farmers, so they were. I was bothering them, but they were like, oh yeah, you donated 7 planes, that was his house over there, My colleagues, though, so I taught, in order to get to China, I was on a Fulbright in Shanghai. And Shanghai is like a 2-hour plane flight from where I needed to go, where our villages were. And then a 3-hour bus journey from there. And but my colleagues at Fudan University, which is, I say it's like Princeton, like the Princeton of China, except that Princeton is now like the #1 university, right? So anyway, so maybe it's like Columbia or I don't know, but it's a good school, a really good university. But when I was telling my colleagues about certain things that happened to family members after 1949, which is code in China for when the communists took over, there were certain things. There were horrible executions that happened, including to my family members. And when my colleagues at work asked me if I was going to write about it in this book, I didn't write about it in this book. It will be for the next book. And I said yes, because I know I'm going to write about it. They said, oh, that's too bad. We'll never get to read your book. Because that won't be translated. This one, though, can. So anyway, so thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sasha, you have a question.
Yeah, I had 2. The first was about at the end you were saying that you were taught growing up not to air dirty laundry and all that kind of stuff. Did your folks put up resistance about you writing this book, putting out this book, and what's their point where they pivoted, where they're like, oh, this is actually great?
I sympathize with certain family members. nobody likes having a writer in the family. So there were family members that were really resistant to talking to me. And I know there are family members who don't like the fact that this book has come out. But when I was working on it, I had to remind them that this is a much larger story than just any single individual, that this is a story that impacted, the entire Chinese American diaspora across the country. And so when I framed it in that way, I think people were more willing to talk. But since then, I would say there's probably about a quarter of my family who is very angry, but 3/4 of my family who love the book. So it really depends on who you ask. It's a real mixed bag.
And I also wanted to ask follow up about the earthquake destroying the city hall. And I was wondering if, I know you said it was more of like a personal history and story, so I don't know how much detail you had about that, but I was wondering what the process looked like of falsely registering as a naturalized citizen, how does that, what did that process look like? You just go into the city hall and.
It was very extensive. So you had to go to the office of the Chinese inspector, and the Chinese inspector was not a Chinese person inspecting you, right? It was where Chinese went to be inspected, and they would grill you. And so when my great grandmother, the one that was the fishmonger's daughter, when she arrived to Angel Island, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area. It has a beautiful view of Alcatraz, right? It is a detention center. She was in her 3rd trimester of pregnancy. And the food was so bad, both on the ship as well as when they were stuck in detention, that she was so far below weight that when the medical examiner examined her, they thought she was in her 2nd trimester. And it was so hard going through her testimony because she, you could tell, I mean, she was just really, she's just like biting her, her lip, biting her mouth, and just going through answering all of the questions. I think in the end, she answered like 77 questions. You just didn't know, it was interminable. You just didn't know if you were going to be freed or if you were going to be deported. She was in a relatively privileged position because her husband was a merchant and he had papers. And during Chinese exclusion, there were sometimes provisions for merchants, but it was all at the whim of the immigration official. You get a bad immigration official, I mean, then that was it. So it was a really grueling process. And it also depends on which iteration, which decade of exclusion we're talking about. My grandfather, Grandpa Jean, the one who was the grandson of the Chinese railroad worker, he was the one who raised me. He was in detention from November. He got in November, and they didn't release him until February the next year. So, and I remember when I asked him, what was it like when you saw America, when you're on the boat? He just looked at me and was like he didn't see anything because they made them go directly into the detention center, right? And when I visited that detention center so many years later, years after he had passed away, I couldn't believe how naive I had been. I was thinking, like visions of Ellis Island, or seeing shore. It wasn't like that at all. You had a question.
Yeah. So in certain parts of the books, in the book, you fictionalize what happens to an extent, or you get into the mind of the individual that you're following. And I was just wondering what it was like to embody that and to get into that headspace, especially since some of them are really difficult. And also when you chose to do, when did you choose to do that? Because you are choosing the moments in which you're going to portray that, I guess, and to take over in that way.
Yeah. So I was really lucky that I've got so many family members who were here during all of these different iterations of Chinese exclusion that I could write from their points of view when I had materials that helped me to do that. When by materials, I mean stories that family members had told me, or documents that their children left behind. I don't know if I mentioned, so I really love the great grandmothers in my book. And I was lucky because their children were so close to them. And during Chinese exclusion, the other thing that happened is that the fathers couldn't easily go back home to the villages because when they did, they never knew if they were going to be let back into the country. So when you look at the genealogy documents, you see that there are like 10-year gaps between the children, right? And that was like when dad was away. And so, but in these gaps, my grandfather was really close to his mother because he didn't know his dad at all. So he was really close to his mother, and my grandfather, Lung, who I haven't really talked about in this presentation, but he's a big character in the book. He had a larger sense of the story. He lived most of his life in our building on the corner of Mott and Pell. And he had left his oral history at the Museum of Chinese in the Americas when it was still the Chinatown History Project. He had written notes for a family story that he wanted to tell. He was a raconteur. He was always telling stories and spinning tales. A lot of his children were like, you can't believe anything he said. But once I started doing the research, I found out that a lot of things they said were true, you know? So I was lucky that those materials existed. And it was from those materials and those stories that I felt comfortable enough to embody my family members' points of view. Other questions? Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Great talk. In the first decades, you were talking about the population spurt between the population. I mean, that's like shocking. I was wondering, so what did that typically look like? The 25% drop in population. I have heard stories of Chinese immigrating to Mexico and to Canada, and there was probably a lower birth rate. Could you just talk a little bit about that? What that looked like?
Sure. So so when we talk about Chinese exclusion, we say 1882, because that's when it was officially on the books. But there were laws that existed before then that contributed to Chinatowns looking basically like bachelor societies, where there were no women and no children. So there were only men, and there was a lot of gambling, to the great consternation of my progressive Christian, family members. There was a lot of gambling, there was opium smoking. There were vices, that people engaged in. But these laws, there was a law before Chinese exclusion that made it very difficult for women to come over. And it was also on purpose, because if you don't have women coming over, then you can't have a next generation of Chinese Americans being born. And prior to that, there was also the 1870 naturalization law, right? So this is era of Reconstruction. They're determining who can vote, who can naturalize to vote, right? It says on the books, white men can vote, right, can naturalize and vote, and then they're arguing, for freed Black slaves to vote. But what starts happening is like the people who are anti-Chinese do a filibuster and basically say we cannot say that Chinese people have the right to naturalization. And they filibuster. When I read about this, I have to admit, I was like, oh my God, it's like today, you know? Anyway, so they enacted filibuster, and it says in the 1870 law that only white men and freed black men can naturalize.
So they made it specific.
It was on purpose that Chinese or Asian people were not included in it. I did not know that when I first read about the law. It took a lot of digging. But I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, just what accounted for that 25% drop and lack of growth and I said that, you know, some kind of like getting wiggle room from the exclusion laws, because they were told they couldn't stay anymore, some of these railroads, right? So some of them went to Mexico. So was that also part of the reduction?
You know, so what you have are men who are sort of stuck in this limbo status. Prior to Chinese exclusion, they were allowed to be here, but they couldn't naturalize and they couldn't vote out the laws, right? So you have this aging population of Chinese folks and no new generation being born. So it's sobering. But then when I give these talks to you know, more like you know, Chinese Americans who have long roots in this country, like my own, everybody knows these stories, right? Because folks came in and like had to come in through the paper network. And there's always like this somber silence. And I think that there was so much shame around what happens, even though it wasn't our fault. And there was a lot of secrecy because if you talked about it, you could get a family member deported, right? So there were very real consequences. So if you ever read Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior and Chinamen, you'll remember in Chinamen, Maxine Hong Kingston talks about her father coming over into this country, and she offers two ways in which he came in. One was on like a banana crate, right, and on a ship, right, hidden in this crate, and the other was coming through Angel Island like my great grandmothers did, right? And she offers these two possibilities. She doesn't tell you explicitly why she's going to offer you these two possibilities, but the reason is her father was still alive at the time, and if she had actually written it straight about how he actually got in, she could have been putting him at risk, right? And so there's another thing too that always comes up for me with this, and it came up for me before I started doing public talks, was I was really worried, like, was this going to just compound people's suspicions that Chinese people were suspicious, right? But what I realized is I was lucky because my grandfather addressed this in his oral history. And he said, all the way back in before he died in 1990, but he did an oral history for 2 years. And in that time period, he said, you know, Chinese people had to lie because they made the laws this way. But if they hadn't made the laws this way, we wouldn't have to lie, right? So I always try to, in my public talks, to, you know, bring it back to this overarching apparatus of the immigration laws that we had at the time. So I just have to be really careful about that. But, you know, in this era of like soundbite and, you know, tweets that are only like how many characters long, how much nuance, right, do you actually get to have? But that is one of the pleasures of writing a book, reading a book, and being able to talk with you here and now. Yeah.
Just one question. Really enjoyed the talk. But in the history of New York in the late 1800s, there were a number of ethnic communities: Jewish, Italian, Ukrainian, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And they seem to have just dissipated and just gotten a lot smaller, potentially don't even really exist anymore. So why do you think that those other communities sort of faded away or shifted, but Chinatown remained and appears to have maybe even grown, because it sort of took over parts of
The Lower East Side. Yeah, so it's a great question. Part of that, if you ask me, which you are, is the effects of Chinese exclusion. You have a community that formed not just because there were common language ties and food ties and cultural ties, but because there was this discriminatory act, and people couldn't vote out the laws and they couldn't court politicians who would listen to them, they needed to stick together, right, and create their own communities. And right around, there was a whole period of time where Chinese people in the 1880s and 1890s, were not, had a hard time renting apartments or even owning a place. But right around the 20s, and then with the Depression, people were selling things. And it was around that time that Chinese people were able to buy up properties. And the reason why Chinatown is still Chinatown, and has been able to fight, to a certain extent, the forces of gentrification, is because many of these buildings are owned by associations. And in these associations, there are memberships. And there are lots of people in these associations, and you would have to get everybody to agree to sell the building. Okay, good luck with that. So, yes.
Question about, you mentioned the anti-Asian hate that we've been all seeing and experiencing. I was wondering, I'm afraid to ask this question on the way, but in your research, did you find any advocates over the 60-year history of this Exclusionary Act? Did you find any allies?
The great Frederick Douglass.
Okay.
Yeah, in the Composite Nations, and and I'll rephrase, let the Chinese come. There were, when I looked at the congressional record, there were Black Southern politicians who voted against Chinese exclusion, and abolitionists, some of the great abolitionists who were, senators and congressmen, they were against Chinese exclusion. But as the years went by, it became a smaller and smaller voice. And I think part of it was because, if people aren't allowed to naturalize and vote, then the politicians aren't really listening to that community. So it's all part of this greater web. But yes, there were allies, and I love them dearly. And I want to thank them every day. Yes.
But how did they feel about Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek and then Mao Zedong? What was the attitude or what's happening about that?
So I can only talk to you about my family members. And so from the research that I've done, there was there were earlier politicos in China that were trying to move China from a dynasty to a constitutional monarchy, like what we have in the UK. And my family members were all behind that, right? But then, I can't remember exactly what happened. The whole thing imploded, and then Sun Yat-sen came to power, and then my family members embraced him and fundraised for him. Unfortunately, but when, again, in China they say 1949. When 1949 happened and the communists took over, my family members said, "Oh well, there goes that. We're here to stay." Many family members had been sending money, back home, they built houses that looked like that, like kind of European Western architecture that they were planning to retire in. But after 1949, they said, no, we're here. So, yeah, so that will be in the next book. There's a question in the back.
Yeah, the part, yeah, I read this in the book, and I think part of the interesting thing about looking back into family history is going back to where you are and seeing where like personality traits are sort of collected in the home. Like for instance, like I didn't realize like why I'm Persian and we had a lot of recipe songs, like songs that would make like say like, oh, you can put a some of this in or whatever. And I didn't realize how much of my family history was based on women being illiterate and needing to do songs and stuff like that. And
Yeah,
so
the oral tradition. Yeah.
Yeah. I was wondering how much of like when you came back from China or when you came back from like your research, like what you started seeing with new eyes in terms of like how this history shaped you in like a lot of ways.
One of the things I didn't get a chance to write about in the book, but I hope with the next book. One of the things I loved was, so it's an oral tradition that we have in our villages. And there are these things called the generational poems. And these poems are, have the character of every person of every generation has that in their name. So it's like, Lee or Sue. So like Mary Sue or whatever Sue, right? Lizzie Sue or like so that name, that part, the Sue part will be in every generation. It will be throughout that generation. I don't think I'm really explaining that correctly. I'm looking at Kathy here. And so every villager could recite that generational poem. And in that poem, they know where they are, where they stand next to their parents, their great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents, and then the generations below. And it is largely gendered, so it'll be their sons, their grandsons, their great-grandsons. I was fascinated by this. I went to our villages and I made people like recount the generation poem. And I thought it was really beautiful, even if it was so gendered. And I really wanted to collect the character from my daughter and give that to her, but nobody ever thinks about the women. So I didn't get that. Any other questions, or how are we?
Maybe one more question if there is one, or I might throw one in if you don't mind.
Yes, please.
Unfortunately, I don't feel like I really learned at all about the Chinese Exclusion Act until I stumbled into, I think, that same exhibition at the New York Historical Society that you mentioned towards the beginning of the talk. Yay, New York Historical Society.
Yeah.
And I admit I'm from Texas, I'm not from the coast, my history education, but whatever, but I still, I was grown up by the time I really should have heard about this. So I wonder how you feel about the general memory of this period in our culture today. To what extent has it been sidelined by subsequent things like Japanese American internment, obviously the Black African American civil rights movement, other things like that? To what extent is it just, this is racism, we just don't hear about this kind of history if we're not of that background?
I think that it's an uncomfortable history, but we are readers and we love history. And it's through literature and stories like this that we understand the lived experiences of people who maybe don't look exactly like you, or me. That's why I love literature so much. I love also, I love reading history as well. But for me, it's important that the narrative take shape and that you learn about larger, like these much larger things that have impacted society through the very intimate personal lens of individuals on the ground. So they really understand what our immigration policy has been. You know, Chinese exclusion was the first federal restrictive immigration policy. It was the first, we had open borders before then. And even so Chinese exclusion doesn't really go off the books until 1965.
Wow.
Right? Because the quota was a stingy 105 per year legal, right? So it still continued many decades after it was repealed. And yeah, so it's anyway, it's hard for people in the community to talk about it because there's such a sense of shame. But I think it's really important to talk about because we need to, look at our history. I also did not learn about this history, but it was the elephant in the room for my family. Like my grandfather who raised me, the mail came under a different name. Right? It was a different alias. And it was the Chinese Exclusion Act name. It was the paper name. And I was like, Grandma, who's that? And my grandmother was like, oh, that's Grandpa's paper name. Anyway.
Well, I think we can all be thankful that we have Mott Street now to help educate ourselves and also just as a wonderful reading experience. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.